As Canadians look to challenges of affordability, increased inflation, as well as increased interest rates, and the challenges of our economy in 2023 and as we look to 2024, today we want to talk about the state of Canada's economy, as well as other related issues. And with me here today to talk about that is the Honourable Joe Oliver, the former federal finance minister, as well as former Minister of Natural Resources. Welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
Well, Joe, I'm delighted to have you and very excited about the opportunity to not only reflect about our economy, but also a number of interrelated issues. There's certainly a lot of moving parts these days, and I certainly enjoy reading a number of your columns about so many things about the state of affairs in Canada, so we'll pick up on some of those themes as well. But I did want to talk a little bit about a fairly recent testimony from another former prominent federal leader. And that, of course, was none other than the former governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge. And he was giving testimony to a federal finance committee. And I think it was a very powerful testimony. I did have a chance to listen to it. And basically, he said, Canadians face a terrible job of choosing between higher taxes and fewer services due to mounting debt. He testified before the committee, and he went on to say, governments cannot borrow their way out of these difficult choices. Your thoughts?
Well, that's certainly true, and that's been a frustration of mine since 2015 when the Liberal government took over. I delivered the last balanced budget.
Indeed, yes.
We've seen, and that wasn't done because of desire for ideological purity. It was done because the Prime Minister believed, and I believed, and still do, that fiscal prudence is important for our country, and it serves the interests of Canadians. What we've had since then is the antithesis of fiscal prudence. What we've had is profligacy, and it was forecast, in fact, and now we're dealing with some of the consequences of it. You may recall that prior to the 2015 election, the then leader of the third party, Justin Trudeau, said that he didn't think there was a particular problem about budgetary balance. In fact, budgets balance themselves.
Oh, yes, I did recall that.
Struck people as an inane comment that really showed a lack of understanding of basic economics. But it was a warning to us, and forewarned wasn't forearmed in this case. Then during the election campaign, he said, well, he derided a bit the conservative, what he felt was an obsession on balanced budgets, and he said he would have a modest deficit in the first 3 years of $10 billion annually. Mm-hmm. $10 billion didn't seem particularly modest, although in the current circumstances, it does, for the wrong reasons. And then in the fourth year, the budget would be balanced. That was 2019, 2020. Well, none of that, of course, happened. What you had was a series of escalating deficits. This year, it's going to be $40 billion, and there is no balance in sight. And the other measure, I guess, that the government had talked about for a number of years, which was the debt to GDP ratio as a target, is also been abandoned. And the result of that spending, which, by the way, exceeded the total spending of all the prime ministers that preceded him.
Sorry, can you repeat that again, Joe?
That is the debt, the debt that was incurred by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau exceeded the total debt produced by all the previous prime ministers since Confederation.
Yeah. It's really hard to conceptualize that. But that's the context, though, Joe, isn't it? That we have a situation where really a number of years ago you were tabling a balanced budget, and now we've racked up more debt than all previous governments combined. And that's the context that we're in, but also where the former governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge, who you know so well, weighs in and says, "Hey, we've got a very serious problem here."
Right.
So this is not a partisan issue.
No, absolutely not. This is an issue of Canada's national interest, and the debt has increased to the point where it's going to reach, I think, $1.2 trillion this year.
Wow.
And the interest on the debt will be about $44 billion, which is, interestingly enough, greater than this year's deficit. In other words, it accounts for all the deficit and more. And of course, with high interest rates and the possibility of interest rates going higher and the deficit continuing, that interest obligation will continue to grow. So
Wow.
this is where we get into an understanding of the problem. It means that rather than money going to social programs, to infrastructure, to healthcare and education, of course, it actually will have to go to something which won't help Canadians in any way.
Right. Yeah.
And that is the repayment of the interest on the debt. But we have no choice. We have to discharge our obligations.
Exactly.
So it means that the growth will be slower, and taxes will be higher, and the average level of prosperity will be lower. A while ago, the OECD did an examination, an analysis of all the wealthy countries in the world, the members of the OECD, of which there are 38. And it concluded during the next 20 years and 20 years following that, in other words, a 40-year period, the growth rate of GDP per capita, which is a measure of individual prosperity, that is the size of the economy divided by the number of people. In other words, how much of the economy does each person have? That measure of prosperity was going to grow less in Canada than every other developed country in the world. We were going to come last.
So, Joe, what you're saying, I recall that analysis well, is that the OECD, the organization that kind of looks at the leading developed nations in the world, is looking at Canada at the bottom. Is that what you're saying in terms of anticipated growth going forward because of these bad public policy decisions? So this is really going to impact Canadians.
Absolutely, and let me give you an example of how that's going to impact us, and we can talk about it. In 1948, two countries became independent, countries that faced an existential threat from the outside and had to spend a great deal of money on their military. Two countries that started off very poor. They were Israel and South Korea.
Yes.
And the OECD is projecting that both those countries will have higher GDP per capita at some point in the next 20 or so years than Canada. Well, good for them, but shame on us.
Exactly. Yeah.
And, you know, Australia is a country 2/3 the size of Canada. And a while ago, it's become a wealthier country in terms of GDP per capita.
Hmm.
So, you know, the question is, why is that? And one of the central problems is productivity, because there are two ways in which you grow. One is by increasing the size of the workforce, and the other is by being more productive.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, you know, we have a bit of a demographic challenge because the population is getting older. We can partially address that through immigration, and the government's focused a lot on immigration, and there are consequences to that, some of it negative in terms of the pressure on housing. But you can't solve the whole problem with immigration. So you have to focus also on productivity. And one of the ways in which productivity increases is by spending more or investing more capital in plant and equipment so workers can become more efficient.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, we have a capital flight problem, the opposite of what we need. Capital in this country is leaving, and capital from outside the country isn't coming in at the same rate it is in other countries. And
Exactly.
what
Yeah.
we're, you know, when we compare ourselves to the United States, we see that problem in spades.
Hmm.
You know, we just had a downturn of I think 0.2% in the last quarter, and if you have another quarter downturn, you're technically
Yeah.
in a recession.
You're
Well,
right
the
on.
U.S. Had, you know, pretty good growth. They've got a huge debt problem as
Hmm.
well, but they have a more robust and more productive
Yeah.
economy. And so that's one of the critical problems that we have to
It
address.
really is.
How do you increase productivity? And you know, there's some ideas about doing that.
So we really have, I don't know, in recent memory, I can't recall this, but it's almost like we have a lot of very important moving parts that Canadians need to be aware of. We've got declining productivity. In fact, we basically will lose kind of a decade of growth here. So we'll be back to 2014 numbers, as if it's, you know, memory serves me correctly. But what you're benchmarking as Canada's performance is really, really mediocre. So we're in a point where our standard of living, do you see that declining over the next decade then, if we, like, a lot of these decisions are setting the foundation for going forward. So when we look to our kids and our grandkids, this is really going to impact their standard of living over time, isn't it, if we continue on this trajectory?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful. I'm not predicting a decline necessarily. Hopefully, that would be disastrous. But what I'm predicting is extremely insipid growth. I mean, we
Hmm.
should, you know, if you have a decline, a continuing decline, then you're in a recession or a depression. And
Hmm.
I'm not predicting a depression. Certainly, there may well be, and there probably will be, an economic downturn. And right now, you know, in the last quarter we experienced that. But what we're talking about is flat or very slow growth. And in the last 5 years or so, for a lot of people, there's been no growth in GDP per capita. In other words, people are standing still. They're just not getting any wealthier. The country's getting a bit bigger, and Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister and minister of finance, was boasting about our better growth rate. Well, that was about a month before our growth rate disappeared
Hmm.
and went negative.
Right.
But what she didn't talk about was GDP per capita, which is how Canadians as individuals are faring, and that's what they know about. They don't know what the macro figures are. They
Hmm.
know how they themselves are doing, and they're not doing well, particularly blue collar workers.
Exactly. Yeah, no, so it's a great concern to people as Canadians. They go through their daily lives, and I hear this all the time from people. It's just that much more difficult to decide what you're going to do. Another stat that I think I found very powerful, it came out just this last week, is essentially the Canadians' per capita income, GDP, is productivity-wise, is about $18,000 less than the average in the United States. So when you look at $18,000, that's not insignificant, isn't it, Joe? I mean, in terms of lifestyle decisions, like we often think that we would be kind of near parity with the United States, maybe a little bit lower. But that $18,000 per capita was a real eye-opener for me, at least.
There was a point during the time I was in government that we were actually ahead of the Americans. So there's been quite a decline since 2015. I mean, we're slowly growing, but in GDP per capita, it's just been flat or very, very weak. And we're talking about, according to the OECD, a growth in GDP per capita over the next 20 years of 0.7%,
wow,
followed by 0.8% for the subsequent 20 years. So basically, over the next 40 years, there's going to be extremely low growth in personal prosperity. And that's a very sad thing to contemplate. And frankly, people should be very worried about it and sort of outraged by it. We've got to do better.
Yeah.
And there are ways to do better, but we need more capital investment. And then so the question is, well, how do you get that? Well, one of the ways, there's a few ways of doing it. One is to reduce corporate taxes to attract capital, because there's a greater chance of turning a profit. And people invest in jurisdictions where they can earn a profit. And
exactly.
Why wouldn't they do that? The other issue is to reduce red tape and excessive and intrusive regulation. Another critical area is to develop our natural resources, and that's a whole other subject. But we have paid a huge price for the government's climate obsession.
Indeed. Well, you've written quite extensively about that. Those whole quote green policies are really not a green dream, but rather a green nightmare. So, the war on affordable energy, on Canadian oil and gas, seems bizarre to me, as we know that part of our economic history and success has been affordable energy, and we've had a diversified variety or sources of energy in Canada, whether it's nuclear to hydro, as well as Canadian oil and gas. And yet this federal government has a war on energy. So what's going on there? Help us explain from your perspective why this is such a terrible policy that will really impact Canadians.
Well, I'll talk about that as to why they're doing it. That's a little more mysterious, and we can get into that as well. But the energy sector represents about 10% of the Canadian economy, and it accounts for I think it's 15 billion in exports and tens of billions of dollars in revenue to governments. We have and it depends on the year, but the fourth largest proven oil reserves in the world and the fifth largest proven natural gas reserves. We're blessed with enormous natural resources, and unfortunately, we can't export any of those resources because to overseas markets, because we don't have any pipelines to Tidewater, and we literally can't deliver. So where we're exporting now is to the United States, and that's fine, except that there's a huge discount on the price that the Americans pay to what the international price is. And so we're basically subsidizing the Americans.
I think this is kind of a dirty secret, quite frankly, in Canada. A lot of Canadians don't realize the point that you're making. You're saying that because we export our oil and gas to really primarily only one customer, namely the United States, we don't get full market price. So the price that we do get is a lower percentage. And it's a bit of a dynamic number based on the market. But what kind of discount are we talking about every year?
Yeah, I don't. I'm sorry, I don't have
Yeah.
that number.
So the point is that we have this discount that's worth a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars every year that Canadians leave on the table because we can't get those pipelines done to serve other markets like Japan and Germany. Like those leaders were here in Canada, and that yet our prime minister said, well, there's no business case to export, what was it, LNG and all the rest to those countries. I mean, you were the former minister, not only of finance, but also former minister of natural resources. I mean, that's absurd, isn't it? We surely we have a business case to export.
Well, of course. You see, firstly, we're suffering from this discount to the U.S. market. But second, we can't sell as much as we have the resources to sell because we can't access these other markets. So it's both a question of discount and a question of volume. And look, I'll tell you a story that I think was indicative. I was in Beijing. I'd been there a number of times, and I had an opportunity to meet with the president of China, Xi Jinping, when the Governor General, David Johnson, was in town, and he had an audience. And normally only leaders, have an opportunity to talk to the president, which is understandable. But in this case, because the Governor General can't discuss politics, when the subject moved to natural resources, he looked to me and I engaged in that conversation. And the bottom line was I had been pushing a concept that Xi Jinping actually agreed with, which is that there's a strategic complementarity between our two countries. We need more markets for our resources, and they need more diversification of their sources of supply because they don't want to buy it all from a small number of companies that might be politically stable. So there was an opportunity there, a golden opportunity, which might even have made our relationship a little less asymmetrical. But in any case, it all came to naught because literally we couldn't deliver. And that's what you see happening when Scholz arrived from Germany and basically begged the prime minister for some of our gas, and then the Japanese want the gas, the British do, and of course, Europeans generally are being squeezed by the Putin regime as part of his I guess retaliation for their opposition to his attack on Ukraine. And so they were facing an energy crisis. Had we had the opportunity to deliver, we could have helped our allies and made a fortune doing it. Unfortunately, we were totally useless. And, in terms of the sacrifice to our GDP, to jobs, to energy security, to national unity, and to having a bigger role internationally, this is actually it's a national tragedy.
It really is a national tragedy because it's really an impact then on ultimately our quality of life as Canadians, because that money feeds, as you said, the jobs and the opportunities for Canadians. And interesting enough, Joe, I would say that also is a tragedy for our environment if you think that cleaner energy is better. We know well that even if Canada ended all its industrial activity, it wouldn't make a whit in terms of ending any concern about climate change using their models, by the way, because India and China are full speed ahead when it comes to the development of their energy sector. So even ending Canada's economy period wouldn't make a difference. So exporting that Canadian energy to places all around the world, including China, would actually help improve the quality of energy that they're using, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, there's two aspects to that. One is that if we were to export more gas and oil to Asia. It would substitute for coal, which is higher emitting, so that
Exactly.
net global basis, we by developing and exporting our gas to Asia, we would be reducing net global emissions, which is, I thought, what environmentalists wanted to see happen. And the other issue that you raised, of course, was we represent a very small proportion of global emissions, about 1.5%. So if we went back to the Stone Age, it would have no meaningful impact on global emissions and zero impact on temperatures.
Yeah.
So, what we're doing this as a kind of a gesture, we're doing it. I mean, the only possible justification for all this self-harm is that, well, we have an obligation to do our part. Well, other countries aren't doing their part.
Right.
China is building more coal-fired plants than the rest of the world combined.
Indeed.
So, and India just sent out a warning prior to a meeting there. Narendra Modi said, don't lecture India about your climate obsessions. So these countries have no intention of sacrificing their economy and undermining their ability to bring people out of abject poverty. They're just not going to do it, and I understand why. Yeah. So Canada is increasingly isolated, actually, because Europe is starting to back off.
I think that's a powerful summation, Joe, because on the international stage, Canada is not an island, and yet we are increasingly isolated. And we're forfeiting opportunity after opportunity to develop our natural resources in a responsible way, in a way that really allows us to have incredible opportunities, and it's ethically produced. And so that for me is as you're alluding to, really quite a national tragedy. And actually, we could be a shining light in terms of helping other countries move forward with their energy needs in a way that's both ethical and responsible for the environment. But for some reason, they're on an ideological one-track show here that it's hard to totally understand.
Well, one other aspect of it I'd like to mention is the fact that these negative policies disproportionately hurt poor people. They hurt poorer people in wealthier countries, and they hurt poorer countries. So we're not doing the ethical thing.
Surely we would look at this and say, wow, they're implementing the so-called just transition in Canada. It's going to do irreparable harm to the oil and gas industry, let alone the rest of the country. Because if you don't have affordable oil and gas industry, it all cascades down to manufacturing, mining, forestry, just about anything that moves in our economy then is going to be undermined significantly. I mean, we know this to be true. So why are the politicians pushing those policies when they know it's going to do irreparable harm to Canadians? That's my question.
Yeah, well, some of them may actually be believers. They all say they are,
Okay.
But what we've seen is the left wing, who are very focused on big government intrusion at the top. Much less concern about personal agency, feeling the government is the solution for everything, and government expenditures can solve any problem, real or imagined. They suffered a big blow with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and were looking for a cause. And then the environmental movement came along, and they grabbed on it because here was an opportunity to take their ideology of big government, small people, and create a kind of a moral imperative. So they use fear, and they use constant propaganda. starting with children. I mean, they've terrorized our kids,
Yeah.
and they've captured, by constant repetition over decades, they've captured the belief of a lot of Canadians or people in the Western world, who aren't aren't scientists, and are constantly told, well, all the scientists agree with this, so how can you question it?
Yeah.
Well, of course, all the scientists don't agree with it. Most do, but you got to understand that for a scientist to take an opposite view is career-ending. Mm-hmm. It also means no ability to get funding for their project.
It's funding.
So they have
exactly.
They have to talk. They have to talk about how their project is going to advance the conventional dialogue. That's why you see a lot of the people who are opposed tend to be a bit older or not in academia, because they can't be hurt. And so Clauser spoke out because what can they do to him? Well, they can vilify him. In fact, he was, but they can't destroy his career. He was supposed to speak. I believe it was before the IMF, and he was scheduled, and then someone looked at it, and they canceled him.
Yeah,
they canceled his speech. They didn't want to hear. They were afraid. You have to assume they were afraid to hear from a prominent scientist a message that went in the wrong direction. They will not tolerate that. I mean, the New York Times will not publish any story that goes against the conventional narrative.
Yeah.
And I know that when, I know it's a matter of policy, but I first encountered it when I was Minister of Natural Resources, and the New York Times wrote a scathing and inaccurate attack on the oil sands. Well, the oil sands are in Canada; they're in Alberta, and so I wrote a reply, measured, calm, factual, and I sent it in, and I thought it would be published, because after all, I was the minister in the country where the oil sands are located that they had vilified, and they wouldn't publish it.
Wow. No,
they didn't want to hear.
Yeah.
I told the story to the Calgary Herald, and they got all excited about it. They published my article. They wrote about the story, but there I was preaching to the converted.
Yeah, but I find that story interesting because, Joe, you probably know this, but a lot of Canadians don't. That there's a whole network across the media, including the weather channels of all things, that agree that we'll stick to this narrative about climate change being an existential threat. So this is not about journalism. This is not about reporting. And this is the contradiction. If you are a scientist by nature, you are open-minded to healthy debate and discussion regarding evidence, and you follow that very carefully. But that's not what we're doing. So that should raise any sensible red flag to any Canadian that you're being manipulated, especially when they introduce fear. And Al Gore, of course, makes all these 10 predictions. Not any of them have turned out, including the end of the earth. So, this is the situation that we're in. So I did want to reflect a little bit more then about our issues of the state of the economy relative to debt, because you powerfully outlined how it seems like this current federal government, among so many others, really don't have any kind of sensible safeguards or curbs, dare we say, if we use the driving analogy, to kind of guide our fiscal decision-making in our country. And from experience that as a country goes into a difficult spot, not just a country can get into a downward spiral as interest rates get up, but so can individuals. So can you help explain to us what's going to happen as interest rates continue to go up and our nation faces those higher interest rates? How is that going to impact our nation?
Well, the concern, of course, is that the average Canadian is quite indebted, particularly in terms of their home mortgages, and we have a much higher proportion of floating rate mortgages than in the United States. So it hits those people immediately. Of course, it'll happen at a time when housing prices go down, so they can be confronting a loss, and then at a certain point, they could end up owing more than the house is worth. Now, we're not at that point. And that's what happened in Japan. And there you can't walk away from your mortgage. So people have been essentially slaves to their homes for decades. I mean, it's really a very, very sad situation. We're not quite there yet, but there is a concern, and there's a concern directed at the banks, which is why they're trading at a lower price now, that there are going to be losses that the banks are going to incur because companies and individuals are not going to be able to cope with the higher interest rate. So that's what is worrying the market. And the Bank of Canada is sort of in this delicate situation. I mean, they have a single mandate, which is to look at inflation. And the governor, Tiff Macklem, has said that's what he intends to do. Well, as long as inflation stays higher than the range of 1 to 3% and the target of 2%, he's going to be inclined to maybe continue to raise rates, and certainly not lower them.
Yeah.
So, and he understands, of course, that if he continues to do that, he will drive the country into a recession. Virtually every recession is the result of bank tightening. So
Indeed.
that's the negative side. Others feel, well, yes, we could have a downturn, but it's likely to be a soft landing, and that's what we don't know at this point.
And let's hope it is. But if we look at history, and I know you're a student of history as well, we look at the 2008 Great Recession. We reflect on the period coming out of the 90s when, in particular, the Chrétien government made some very difficult choices. You've made difficult choices as a finance minister as well. Are there signs that Canada's getting in that zone of a tipping point where the government just can't keep spending out the money, the deficits, and racking up the debt as those interest rates rise? Where are the signs, if you were finance minister today, that you'd have to start cutting and making some difficult decisions here? Because if you don't, you know what it's like. It's just going to be all interest charges, and then it's going to squeeze out everything else, including healthcare and education and everything else.
Well, we're there. We can't. This imprudence can't continue indefinitely. I mean, the fiscal profligacy. You can't borrow your way to prosperity. The Chrétien government discovered that in the 1990s. There was an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, calling the Canadian dollar the Northern Peso.
Indeed. And, yeah.
They realized that the bond rating services were reducing the credit rating, and we could have a crisis where the country couldn't continue to borrow. So they, confronted with that, they started tightening up. They sent less to the provinces.
But do you think we're at that point now where
I
you're
don't
going to start seeing that?
We're quite there, but we're at a point where we're hurting, and it can't go on. And even this government is starting at least not to do anything, but to pretend to do something. So you had.
So what do you mean by that? Pretend to do something?
Well, here's the best example of that pretense is Anita Anand, who is the president of the Treasury Board. Was given the assignment of finding, I think it's $15.4 billion in savings.
Yes.
Okay. Now, that sounds like a lot of money.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, it's a nothing burger.
Right.
Because, and this is over, I think, a 5 or 7 year period. So the first year will only be a laughable $500 million, which is, I mean, you're talking about less than 2% of the expenditures.
Hmm.
And in any case, they up the expenditures and now they're going to
Hmm.
reduce the increase by a bit.
Right.
That's not
Yeah.
really
No,
uh,
it's
dealing with. I mean, it's sort of a sleight of hand,
sounds like
and
a head fake, Joe. Um,
it is.
so just to also reflect on a related topic, when we were talking about um, the environmental policy, is the whole area of ESG. You've written about it, environmental social governance. It's been quite an interesting movement. A lot of different actors have really promoted ESG, like Larry Fink and company at BlackRock, and it's even infected. Like, this is an index where they basically take these woke causes and put them into an index, and some companies have adopted them. Even banks, credit unions, pension funds. The good example I give is the one with the Canadian pension plan, using kind of I understand, an ESG index to choose, and I'm sure you noticed this right away, Joe, is they chose Russian oil and gas to invest in over Canadian oil and gas. I mean, you can't make this up. It's unbelievable. So as you look at this ESG movement, and there's been a lot of pushback, a lot of U.S. states are banning ESG indexes because who are you as a company to start inserting all these other kind of woke values when you should be getting maximum returns to me as an investor? So my question is this. So do you think that movement is kind of peaking and backing off? I know that Vanguard, I think, is backing away from ESG. It's hard to know what they're doing exactly, but what's your read on that?
Funds that have said they're going to focus on green investing have done very poorly. So undermined it. And I mean, essentially, this ESG movement has a certain appeal. You say, well, let's take into account some things which are good for society and are moral and so on. But this is not the role of business. The role of businesses should be to be profitable for their shareholders, which is good for their employees and good for society and good for their bottom line, on which they have to pay taxes.
Right.
So it's good for economic growth.
Well, and follow the law. It's not like they're going out investing in companies that are irresponsible, right? So, yeah. So do you think it's more of a fad? Are they greenwashing?
Well, yeah, they are doing some greenwashing for sure. Whether it's a fad or not, I don't know. It's because so many people have bought into it. And in Canada, I mean, if you stand against ESG, you're standing alone. And people like Mark Carney, are trumpeting ESG on the other side. And what's disappointing is how all the companies initially came on side. Now they don't have a choice because it's prescribed by regulators, by governments, and by their overseers.
Yeah. But again, this is an opportunity where, as Canadians, you need to speak up. And I know that at the retail level, there's increasing questions being asked because, hey, you should be serving me and my returns, not just some woke agenda. So I think that's an interesting one that we'll continue to monitor in Canada.
Right.
So I did want to ask you a little bit about the whole issue of some of the international relationships that are occurring here in Canada. It's almost like a perfect storm. And just to step back for a moment, in Canada, we're relating to many larger powers, obviously the preeminent superpowers, the United States, and then of course we have China as the other superpower. And then we have the emerging superpower, namely India. And I don't think I've ever seen in our history a moment where Canada has been really under very stressed, bad relationships with not only China as a superpower, but the emerging one, namely India. And I know it's complex, but what the heck is going on with Canadian foreign relations here when we are being adept at ticking off both a superpower and an emerging superpower? How do you do that?
Well, I think there's an acknowledgement, including in global affairs, that Canada has lost ground internationally. And part of the reason for that is that we keep virtue signaling and irritating countries with our moral posturing that they're not impressed particularly with, and we don't follow it up with any robust donations or an ability to help our allies, who we have an obligation to spend 2% in NATO of our GDP on the military, and the Prime Minister actually said it's never going to happen. I mean, that was kind of astonishing. So why would they care about Canada? Because we're pounding our chest and saying how great we are, but we're not delivering. Well, who cares what you think? We're harming ourselves. They're sort of bemused by that, and our energy competitors are happy with it. They're laughing all the way to the bank. But our other allies are irritated that we're pretending to be superior, and we're not. We're free riders. This is not a way to make friends and influence people.
So, Joe, you have spent years in the House of Commons. You've seen many guests come into the House of Commons. We know that they're all vetted. How did the gentleman who was part of an SS unit in the Ukraine get into the House of Commons? Is there an easy answer to that?
I don't know. It's kind of puzzling. The speaker, was thrown under the bus, and he did have to resign because he made a terrible error in honoring this individual without checking him out. I think he realized halfway through the presentation, you could see him pause when he said, "This is a great hero," and he fought against the Russians. Well, wait a minute. The Russians were our allies during the Second World War. If he was fighting against the Russians, he had to be on the side of the Germans.
Yeah, wow.
That's not good. And then it turned out he was in the SS.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, look, you just don't let anyone walk in to a reception that the Prime Minister is giving. And I assume there was something like that. But at the minimum, he was coming into the House of Commons. So there had to be some other check. And so the question is, why did he get in? When the most elementary kind of check would have. I don't know how it happened. It seems like a combination of incompetence and negligence. It's very, very bad because we're a laughing stock. And the person most hurt by it, of course, is Zelensky, because he is fighting this false propaganda from Russia that they're in there to denazify the country, and then he stands up and applauds an old Nazi. I mean, what could be worse?
So stay tuned on that one. I guess the other one that we'll stay tuned in terms of the political scene is really the long overdue inquiry into the level of Chinese interference, specifically from the Communist Party of Canada in elections in Canada. That certainly there's lots of evidence pointing in that direction. And do you have any hopes coming out of that public inquiry, Joe?
Well, there's if it's done in anything like a competent way, and now, of course, it's going to include India as well. The facts on the ground, I think, are pretty bloody compelling. I mean, you've got Chinese police stations, you've got an attempt.
So you're saying there's Chinese police stations still operating in Canada?
Well, it hasn't been total. They said they were dealing with it, but I haven't heard anybody say that they've all gone. So
yeah, it's
if they've all gone, they would have said it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's definitely pressure on the Chinese Canadian community to toe the line, and Chinese students who come here, and also the Chinese language press. You know, these groups and organizations are subject to a lot of Chinese pressure to toe the line, and these don't play nice.
Yeah, so this is a reality again that we really need to get to the facts and the evidence, because this is a very important matter to safeguard our Canadian democracy, period.
Absolutely.
So,
yes. And this government has been very weak. You know, the Prime Minister has a sort of a strange affection. He said this is, you know, their basic dictatorship is what they admire. He admires most. Well, you know, maybe he has a whole Oedipal thing going, or whatever, his father and all this sort of stuff. But because his father was a great lover of China and Cuba. But you know, this is a serious business.
It really is serious.
The reaction to the Chinese outrages is so muted compared to his reaction to India's potential involvement in the murder of a Canadian citizen, which I do not condone. Yeah. But the reaction to those two, you know, one was a whole series of events, and the other was one event, and you know, it's just an amazing contrast, and not an attractive and reassuring one, I have to say that.
Indeed. So as we kind of come to the close of our discussion, Joe, one of the things that I did want to highlight was you had a very eloquent recent column about Canada and our tradition and emphasis on a respect for freedoms of individual rights and freedoms, for really out of that Anglo-Saxon tradition, the rule of law, amongst so many other very important agreements about how we live together peacefully in a high-functioning way as a society. Can you tell us more about the importance of those that culture to enabling Canada to go forward, and the importance that political leadership safeguard those cultures so that we can continue to have not only a peaceful society, but a prosperous society that serves the next generation?
Look, this relates to who we are and Canadian values, and we honor democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and equal treatment under the law. And our political leaders should be working to strengthen those values and unify the country. Unfortunately, this leader, our current Prime Minister, and some of the woke madness that's affecting a lot of countries in the West is divisive and is undermining that. I mean, the critical race theories and other neo-Marxist ideologies are pitting groups against each other. They're good guys and bad guys. You know, they're people who are born guilty because of their race, and others who are born victims because of their race.
What a horrible thought.
In the first case, they're irredeemably guilty and evil, and in the other case, they're irredeemably failures. Well, that's not a healthy society. That's not a country that's going to grow and prosper in peace and harmony. And I'm afraid that some of the political philosophy and the partisan divisiveness, because it isn't only ideology, it's narrow partisan, an attempt to create advantage, is really is driving a wedge, and it's also driving, you know, the climate policies have driven a wedge geographically as well, and that's undermined national unity and exacerbated regional tensions. So we've gone pretty far in away from the concept of being the peaceable kingdom that Canada wants to be, and honors you know, order and good government. And I worry about that because that's culture, and culture is hard to change, but change it we must.
Indeed, and well said. The Honorable Joe Oliver, the former Minister of Natural Resources and the former Minister of Finance at the federal level. We want to thank you for joining us and thank you for your challenge to be involved as citizens to safeguard our culture and our democracy. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.